Hello everybody, it's Jodie Thornton here, and I want to talk today about what we do when we have parenting triggers coming up really often. So I want to be clear before I get started that the type of triggers I'm talking about are the garden variety triggers as we would refer to it, in colloquial terms. So I'm not talking about the type of triggers that come from PTSD or CTPSD or the specific definition that triggers have in the mental health space. I'm just talking about the way we would talk about triggers when we talk to our friends. So in parenting, there's a lot of talking about how we need to manage our triggers so that we don't impact our kids. And I think that that is the hardest way to do things. I think it's the hardest way to just be able to handle a trigger. And if I conceptualize a trigger as like the heaviest baggage you could imagine, if you imagine trying to build up your muscles so that it's easy for you to get around with that baggage on you, that's going to take some time, right? But what if we could just put the bag down? Or like, what if the bag wasn't yours anymore? Like, there's other ways, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so with our parenting, it is very, very rare that the next step I recommend to parents is focusing on things like mindfulness. The vast majority of parenting concerns that people bring to me are the type that do not need mindfulness. What they need is actually better problem solving. So if we think about this from a triggers perspective, I recommend one of three courses of action. One is that we disconnect the trigger from what's happening in your day-to-day. That means that your children will still be doing the behavior that you would find triggering, but that your nervous system doesn't recognize it as a trigger anymore. So the baggage is still there, but it just doesn't come up when it comes to your parenting. The second, and I'll go through in detail how we're going to do that. The second thing we can do is actually heal the trigger, which is, in most cases, it's a lot easier than people think. Like, it really, really is. So that is an option, is to heal the trigger. And the third option, which I want everyone to make sure that you see as a totally valid and viable option, which is we can parent around it. And I kind of think about this as like, I'm totally mixing metaphors today about like buttons versus baggage, but anyway, go with me. If we think about parenting around the trigger, it'd be like the button still exists, but you put it up high where your kids can't reach it. Right? It's like basically what we're doing day to day. So if we think about step number one is disconnecting the trigger. So what that would look like for me is when we think about what a trigger is, and again, I'm talking about this in the generic way that we would talk about triggers, not in the way that mental health services would define triggers, and not in the way that is specific to PTSD and CTPSD, but just our garden variety triggers. So what those garden variety triggers are is that something happens, like just an ordinary thing. Your child refuses to put their shoes on, they have a massive tantrum, they speak to you with a certain tone of voice, like something happens. Your nervous system, when it notices that you don't know how to fix that problem, your nervous system goes looking for, when has this happened before? And when it finds one, and usually many examples of this problem coming up, something that looks or sounds like this problem, and it's like, that thing is still not resolved, we do not know how to handle that, this is not okay. And that's where the panic comes from. That's where the intense reaction comes from, because your body treats this as though it is a crisis. And so if we were thinking about disconnecting the trigger from your parenting, what we can do first is actually just solve the problem. Because if you know how to solve the issue, your nervous system doesn't get the chance to go, well, this is a problem that isn't solved. How big of a deal is it when I look back? Ooh, actually, it's a really awful problem for me that I don't know how to solve. Well, if you solve the problem, that doesn't, you cut it off before it even starts. So when I say solve the problem, I'm talking about things like having strategies to know how to get your children to cooperate, know how to get them to listen in a way that is values aligned for you, that feels like it's the kind of parenting you want to be doing for your child, and you know that works for them as well as working for you. Knowing how to handle when they're not listening to you, and this is not about staying calm, but like if they're not listening, I know what I'm going to do about that. You know, like that, if you have that already part of your day-to-day routine, if they don't listen, no biggie, like you've solved the actual problem. In terms of big feelings, knowing if you know how to hold space for your child's big feelings, that takes a huge weight off of, for a lot of people, that takes a huge weight off of triggers. If you know how to, this is a key one, if you know how to help your child process something that happened earlier, what that means then is that whenever anything comes up that you don't know how to solve in that moment, or you don't have the time or energy to solve in that moment, you know you can come back and help them process it. You know that it's not a crisis, right? So these are all different ways that we can solve the actual problem we have at hand, which means the trigger doesn't even get bumped in the first place. The second thing we can do to disconnect the trigger from the parenting situation is that if we can recognize that it is not a crisis that this problem is not solved. So that might look like, my kid's not listening, that's a problem for me, it's not a crisis that it's not solved. That one can take a little bit of practice, and it can take, it's probably one of the slower ways, so I probably don't always recommend going down that path first, but it is a helpful thing when we're thinking about how can we disconnect it. But you can actually get in the habit of practicing coaching yourself through it. This is a problem. He is not listening to me. I'm not okay with that. I do not know how to fix it, but it's not a crisis, right? You can get used to coaching yourself. Again, I think it's a slow way, but it is a viable option. The next thing we can do is take a look at where the trigger came from for you, and then notice that it's different to this scenario. So for example, we might see, say for example, your child is really upset that that something's happened to them at school. Someone's spoken to them really unkindly. And when the trigger for you is that that's similar to something that's happened to you when you were a child, and you didn't have the support you needed to be able to process that, and it stayed with you. When we look at what's happening for your child, we can look at the fact that they are growing up in a completely different time, in a completely different family, and there is no reason for us to believe that this particular situation is going to be something that stays with them. That you have more capacity to help them than the adults that were available to you when you were a child. That you know that you may not have the skills right now, but you know that it's possible to heal those things and not need to wait until you are 30 or 40 or 50 before you heal those things that happen to you. You can heal them very quickly once you know how, even if you don't know how yet. If you can reassure yourself that that is a possibility, then all of a sudden we can look at, oh, the reason why that landed so difficult and so hard for me is because I had all these things going on, and those are not relevant for my child, so therefore this is not the same. And that can just help us get a little bit of distance that actually, that I haven't touched the trigger, but I've recognized that the trigger is not relevant to this parenting situation. And that can be a really quick and easy way for us to disconnect things sometimes. So that's our first option, is we're just going to disconnect the parenting trigger from the parenting experience. Sorry, the trigger from the parenting experience. That's one option. Our second option is actually to heal the trigger. Now this one, I say it is simpler than most people think, because most of us have a perception that the damage that happened to us as children is with us forever. It's like something has been taken from us that cannot be built back. And in my view, again, I'm going to mix metaphors. Like, I don't really know if it's like a piece that's taken, but if it is, it's something that can be rebuilt. And I kind of tend to think about it more as it's not so much something that's taken, but more like some gunk that gets on us. And once we know how to wash it off, it goes, right? And it's easy to say that can't happen. I've been working on my issues for a long time. But there's a lot of processes that we think are appropriate for handling the baggage that we have from our past that are either ineffective or they are the slowest way you could do it. There are some much more effective and much quicker ways for us to really heal what has happened for us in the past. Now, when we think about healing, sometimes, like I have personally helped clients deal with big, difficult triggers in a single session. When we have been able to look at how this has happened, when we've been able to look at it in a way that we can recognize what did my client really need in that moment, what was it that was missing there, and also what meaning did my client make of that situation. And when we can see that the meaning, the vast majority of the time, if we've still got a trigger around it, usually the meaning that we made of that situation was a little bit off. So it might be something like, we might have made a situation, if I can't make my parent feel better, then I will be unsafe. And there are cases where that is actually true of people's upbringing, and it's not a meaning, it's actually not true right now. If you don't make your child feel better, you're no longer unsafe. That's not true. But there are other cases where we weren't actually unsafe. We just didn't have anyone else to talk to, or we just didn't have any other way to process it. And so that being the case, when we look back at that, we can really unpack and heal those triggers at the root cause. And so that gives us a whole lot more freedom. Having said that, sometimes when we open the lid, more things come out than we realized were there. And it's not always possible to deal with that in a single session. Sometimes it's something we'll work on over time. And so in that case, I only recommend going down the healing path when either it's something that you might notice that this thing is affecting you in many areas in your life, or also it might be something that, it's just been coming up, and I would rather deal with it than let it be there. And so in those cases, we will just go down the healing path. We just go down through talking it through. Now, personally, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I can't help people with the kinds of triggers that require a mental health professional, but I have helped people deal with a lot of what we would call garden variety triggers, like things that we would talk to our friends about, that's a trigger for me. I've helped a lot of clients through that, just through a normal coaching process, and it is freeing, and it is beautiful, and it can be difficult, and it's all of the things. But there is a difference between the things that we need a mental health professional for and the things that actually are just needing to be heard and considered and understood in a different way. And that's something that I help people with. That's part of my routine work, is to help people to actually heal those things for themselves. Now, the third option, which again I want to stress that this is a really, really viable option, is to parent around it. And what I mean by that is, say for example, if we think about a trigger where, say for example, a child is, their way of communicating when they're upset is to speak in a really aggressive tone. Now, for most parents, what I would suggest in that case is actually to help the child learn how to speak in a more respectful tone, but I would take away that a path that would most likely look like me saying, reflect back to your child what they would say if they could say it in a calm fashion. And that is usually the quickest way to get our child to not revert to that aggressive tone when they're upset. But if this is something that is a real trigger for you and it's too much for you to take that path, then we can use boundaries around that. So we can use boundaries around you may withdraw when your child speaks in that tone. And that doesn't mean that we're punishing the child. In no way are we punishing the child. What we're doing is saying, I feel unsafe when you use that tone, so I need to withdraw myself. I need to move away from you. But that when you see a lot of parenting experts will say, you don't ever do that when a child needs you. The fundamental assumption that they're making is that you've got no other time or place to deal with this issue. You can talk to your child about the aggressive tone they make at a different time when they are regulated. You can help them practice using the respectful tone of voice. You can help them learn to communicate. You can help them avoid getting as upset as they were in order to use the aggressive tone. You can do that at a separate time. And so whenever the incident happens, you withdraw and protect yourself, but separately to that, you're helping your child learn a better coping mechanism that works better for them and works better for you. So it's not a case, you'll see a lot of parenting experts say basically the fundamental assumption is that someone has to sacrifice. And because we as parents are unhealthy, because we were raised in an unhealthy society, they may use different words for that, they may say all different things, but fundamentally that's what it is. Our society is not emotionally healthy. So because we are the unhealthy ones and the children are innocent, that means we have to sacrifice. And that is just fundamentally untrue. We can do all of the healthy things without sacrificing. There is always another way. There is always another way for us to get the outcome we need. So the idea that you would be withdrawing when they speak to you in an aggressive tone, this would only be a short-term strategy because we're using other strategies to remove the problem happening in the first place and remove it in a way that is healthier for your kid. So I want to say that that idea that we can parent around it, like if you don't have the time or inclination to delve into solving the problem, if you're a bit afraid to look under the box and see what's there in relation to the trigger for you, and it's either something that you're not ready to do emotionally, you have other priorities happening right now, perhaps even the financial aspect is that maybe you could afford 1 or 2 sessions with me, but you couldn't afford a big package if that's what it turned out to be necessary, then it is totally 100% valid to parent around it. When we parent around it, we teach our kids that we're not trapped by any limitations that we have, and we're not trapped by any limitations that other people have. We can still look after ourselves. We can still look after other people. We can always find a solution that works for everybody. And so I suggest these options in that order for a reason. I think disconnecting the trigger is the quickest way, and it also gives you so much more space. Once you've disconnected your core triggers from your parenting, it gives you so much more space to build what actually works. And that means it's so much easier for you to practice when you don't have to worry that if it doesn't work straight away, you're going to be triggered. It's so much easier to practice when you know that you can make a mistake and it's not going to be permanently damaging for your child. Once we're in that space, it's just everything becomes quicker and easier. So that's why I recommend doing the disconnection as the first option, even before the healing. Because often, this is the second part about the healing, is that often any triggers that we still have that are alive from usually our childhood, but sometimes it's experiences we've had as adults, any triggers that we have that are alive, every time that trigger comes up, we are reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing the neurological pattern that causes that trigger to exist. So when we disconnect the trigger from our parenting experience, what that does is it stops us reinforcing it. So we're no longer reinforcing that trigger. So the more you create what works, some of the triggers, they either dissolve or they become a lot weaker because we're not reinforcing them. Then when we come time where we cannot get through something because the trigger won't budge, that's when we know it's time to do the healing. That's when we know that this is something to focus on, and it's also something that tells us that this is the trigger that actually needs work. Whereas if we start off by let's heal all your triggers, that can take a really long time, and it may not be necessary for you in the stage of life that you're at. It may be possible for you to disconnect quite a few of your triggers, and then we only need to deal with 1 or 2 in relation to parenting, and then those other triggers are not necessarily, sure, we haven't healed them, but if they're not actively making problems in your life, then we don't need to spend time dealing with things that are not actively causing problems in your life. So that's kind of how I recommend. And then we'll use the parenting around it whenever we need to. If you've got big priorities in other areas in your life, if you've got things that are happening outside of your parenting that are huge and need your attention, we do not have to solve every parenting problem right now. We can parent around whatever we need to parent around, and you can come back to that when life settles more. Even within your parenting, there are times where there's big things happening that, you know, healing your triggers is just not the next priority. And so we can do it quickly and efficiently by just parenting around it just for now. So I hope this has been really helpful, and I'm really interested in any questions that you have around this. If you would like to talk to me about the triggers that are coming up for you and what I would recommend, or even if you're curious about like what would it look like to solve the problem so that the triggers weren't coming up, anything like that, if you'd like to jump on a call with me, you can book at jodiethornton.com/15, and we can have a chat. It's 15 for 15 minutes, and it's the digits 15. And we can just have a chat about where you're up to, what you might need, and where we could go from there. Thank you so much for watching.